From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello, and welcome to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Well, Indiana lawmakers are done, at least for now. They went ahead, they passed a budget, they did criminal justice reform and lots of other things, and also a possible lawsuit between the governor and the legislature. And so we'll talk about that with our panel today, Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Lindsay Ships, and Libertarian Lindsey Marie. So, Mike, let's go ahead and start with you. Overall, how do you think lawmakers did this year?
Well, I thought they did amazingly well considering the challenges of the past year and the challenges of handling both an influx of state money and a better than expected revenue forecast as well. I mean, they got 90% of their work done in the last 5 or 6 days, which is not unusual, I guess. Just the amounts involved were unusual.
Lindsay Ships, from a Democratic perspective, how do you think Republicans and the lawmakers did this year?
You know, it was such an unprecedented year coming in with COVID, and I was truly concerned that the haves and have-nots would shake out poorly for this budget. But I really had a negative feeling going into it, but especially after all of the conversations that happened on both the Senate and House sides, I'm so glad that the influx of federal dollars was able to make a budget happen for Hoosiers that was fair and balanced, and also was going to help not only the Hoosiers who are disabled and seniors, but everybody.
Lindsay Ships, Lindsey Marie, my favorite Libertarian. How do you think lawmakers did this year?
Yeah, I think this was a really extraordinary year in terms of just the circumstances they had to deal with. I don't think that anyone wanted to be in their position and envied them whatsoever. But I think at the end of the day, when we look at the budget and what happened, I don't think any libertarian is going to be happy, especially when both Republicans and Democrats were happy about it. That normally signals that we aren't the ones very happy at the end of the day.
Well, let's take a look at the budget. Obviously, $36 billion budget, lots of new money for schools, education, money for law enforcement as well. Mike, was there anything in the budget that stuck out to you?
Well, certainly. I think there were some very wise investments. One is in teachers' salaries. I mean, 15 years ago, and I think it can probably continue into today, a teacher in Perry Township, Indianapolis, with a master's degree makes less than an Indigo bus driver. We need good bus drivers, but we also need to attract women and men to be teachers as well. And I think the investment went some ways towards ameliorating that. The $250 million in broadband is a huge boon to the rural communities. That is, if you can't work out of your home if you don't have broadband, and that limits broadband to people near the larger communities, and working from home to the larger communities. So I think that was a big boon. But I think one that is really not been talked about yet is the $500 million set aside with a lot of eligible projects, including the Elanco project, the bus and truck plant, a brand new state archives. We have an archives on 30th Street where a strong thunderstorm could blow down and blow away our entire state history. It also includes a consolidation of the deaf school and the blind school. Just a whole lot of important projects that we're able to squeeze in literally in the last 5 days.
Lindsay Ships, let me ask you, was there anything in the budget that stood out to you in particular that I was going to say is good for Hoosiers?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that we finally found a way to increase funding for the first time since the budget in 2009 to increase funding for Indiana's food banks. The Feeding Indiana's Hungry program is managed by one person, and the overall was $300,000 the past 15 years to fund this program. And of course, during COVID, we've seen the state really leaning on them to help fix these issues and help fix feeding our families who are in need right now. And I was so glad that they finally found ways to improve the funding for Feeding Indiana's Hungry.
Lindsey Marie, let me ask you, was there any program that you think should not have been funded?
Oh, that's a loaded question, Abdul. I might pass a little bit on that part. I think also the other thing that we need to pay attention to is also tax increases. So these things kind of go hand in hand, and we look at the e-cigarette tax increasing at 15%. what that's going to do is undermine what the tax is supposed to do. The tax they think will allow children to stop smoking and vaping because they won't want to pay this increased amount. All that's going to do is then cause them to start smoking cigarettes. Same with adults. We've seen this time and time again. When you raise the tax on e-cigarettes, then regular smoking goes back up. And the CDC has said that if you're an adult that's smoking, you are better off vaping than actual smoking cigarettes. So all this is going to do is make a big problem, and it's not going to be good in the long run when you look at cancer rates in the state of Indiana.
Mike, I want to change gears a little bit and ask you about sort of the federal component of the state budget. Obviously, there was like $600 million for teacher pay and some other things, but this is just a 2-year proposal. Do lawmakers just kick the can down the road a little bit and Uncle Sam sort of save the day, or are they going to look at this long term?
Well, it was clearly Christmas in April, Abdul, and the holidays, as you know, never last forever. So in 2 years, there's a big hole to fill. I'm worried about, I'm glad, by the way, that the state paid down huge chunks of debt, particularly teacher pension debt and things like that, because that never happens, rarely happens. But the pay in teachers, the pay increase for teachers, we don't have an ongoing source of revenue for that. And so are they going to get a 2-year raise and then everybody drives off the cliff? I don't know, but it's something that we really have to plan for. I'm really nervous about ongoing commitments based on Christmas gifts in April.
Lindsay Ships, let me ask you about that, because obviously, thanks to the Biden administration, India had a lot more money to play with from the federal level. But are we just, with the Ships, those one-time expenditures, like buildings and paying off debt, did we kick the can down the road, particularly when it came to education funding and teacher pay?
I think we have finally caught up to where we need to be. As Mike pointed out, we've got teachers with master's degrees who aren't being paid what they need to be paid. We've got teachers at every level not receiving the payment for their services that they should be receiving. And I think it's no secret that Indiana is behind with a race to the bottom in teacher pay. So this was time to make it happen. And it's up to state leaders to find out how to make it happen in the future. Either we can make this a handsome environment for teachers and for students to continue keeping, hopefully, our talent here in Indiana, or not.
Lindsay Marie, let me ask you about that teacher pay issue. Did we kick the can down the road for teacher pay? Because like I said, obviously, for the next 2 years, everything is fine. But then after that, we've got another issue.
Exactly. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 years. I feel like they're setting themselves up to fail. The other component is they've gone ahead and said this money is supposed to be for teacher pay. But correct me if I'm wrong, it's up to the districts to actually make that happen, because the key word we keep missing in a lot of this conversation is from lawmakers, we expect this money to go to teacher pay and we hope, but how do we know it actually will at the end of the day?
Our guests on the program today are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Lindsay Ships, and Libertarian Lindsay Marie. You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org, as we come to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Well, one point of contention, my panel, that lawmakers saw this year was the governor, and also the legislation over who has the authority to call a special session. Lawmakers passed the bill. The governor vetoed it. They overrode his veto. Mike Murphy, let me start with you. Where do you see this conversation going?
It goes straight to court, and the only winners will be the trial lawyers who the Republicans love to hate. This is a clear smackdown by the legislative leadership against the governor. I haven't seen this disrespectful of a move against a governor of the legislator's own party in the 40 years I've been involved in Indiana politics. It's inevitable to cause problems. And I think the political fallout between the governor and the legislature is going to be not pretty.
Lindsay Ships, let me get your idea. Is this basically Republican on Republican violence here, or is there something else going on?
Time certainly will tell. I truly hope that this, we had a very big kumbaya with the budget this week, where this second floor versus third floor with the governor versus the legislature, I think really being overstated. And then we saw all leaders coming together to discuss the the wins and the movement forward on the budget on, I think that was Tuesday, that Monday that we had a press conference with all leaders. But to be honest with you, I think this really has implications on other legislation that folks are seeking vetoes on. And so I think this will really stand to impact other legislation like the wetlands legislation, highly divisive legislation. I think this will stand to impact the governor's take on those.
Lindsay Marie, let me ask you, in a constitutional fight, who wins, the governor or Indiana lawmakers?
I hope Indiana lawmakers, but we'll see what happens. I think this is not just about respect. I think this is also about looking farther down the line. And I think Republicans have learned from what's happening at the national level that when you have the power of the pen, things are great. But when your so-called opponent gets the power of the pen, you're not so happy. So if you want it when you're in office, that means you have to deal with it when the other person's in office. And I think they're seeing that, and they're wanting to prevent basically what we've seen at the national level. I think also that one individual should not have power of the entire state. I think per the Constitution, the legislative body should be the ones making the laws. And I think Erica Holcomb went ahead and went over that.
Mike, let me ask you about that, because one of the issues has been is that instead of tinkering around with the Constitution and saying, no, do lawmakers have the authority to call a special session or don't they? I frankly think they don't, just from my reading of the Constitution several times. But why go that route as opposed to just tinker with the governor's emergency authority that was given to him back in 2001 after 9/11, also shortly after World War II? Why not go that route as opposed to go by tinker with the Constitution by giving themselves the power to call a special session?
Well, I first of all, I think the legislature leadership decided to go that way because, number one, it's easier, even though it's clearly unconstitutional. I mean, even a first-year law school student at the worst law school in America will recognize that, number one. Number two, I think they did it because they think he's weak. And he's a problem solver. He's a bipartisan guy. He is not a guy who, beats the table and, is very demonstrative. And so I think that they think he's weak. I think they find that he's not weak. And I disagree with Lindsay. The governor always wins because legislators are important for about 12 weeks a year. And after that, they go back to their hometowns and they are nothing. And the governor controls the purse. The legislature can appropriate the money. The governor does not have to spend it. He could shut down the INDOT projects in all the recalcitrant Republicans' districts, for example. He can refuse to accept their recommendations on hiring and appointments. I mean, he has more power than any legislator can believe, and those legislators may appreciate his power in the next year.
Well, let's jump over to Lindsay Marie, our Libertarian, and get her reaction to that. Lindsay, what do you think about what Mike just said?
I think he's saying what I feel, which is there's too much power in the hands of the governor. The governor, one single person, should not have that much power. That's not the way things were intended, and that's not the way things should be. So if we recognize that he can do all these things, if he gets angry and it wants to be spiteful, maybe we should rein some of that power back. Maybe we should make sure that emergency orders or whatever he's doing is constitutional. Maybe we should make sure that the legislative body are the only ones making law per the Constitution.
Lindsay Ships, let me throw something at you here real quick here, because this is where my conspiracy theory friends kind of go off the rails a little bit. One of the things that they say is that Indiana lawmakers knew that giving themselves the power to call emergency authority was unconstitutional, but they did it anyway, knowing that the courts would throw it out. But this way they can say, hey, to the constituents who are mad and upset about what the governor has done, they can say, hey, you know what? We tried, we passed a bill, the governor vetoed it, we overrode it, the courts threw it out. Hey, we gave it our best shot.
I've never seen this many varying opinions on the third floor in my 15 years at the legislature. It's a lot to manage. I really don't envy legislative leadership having to juggle all of these viewpoints in their own caucuses. It's a miracle that we got legislation passed this year. It was a miracle there was a kumbaya on the budget. Thank God for all the money that the Joe Biden administration sent us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been in this situation with the budget situation that we were. So I'll be honest with you, I have no idea how they juggle it all. But I really have, and I don't have to tell you this, Abdul. working on the third floor is a very big vacuum. I don't think there are things that happen in the rest of the world that folks seem to notice while you're in budget negotiations on the third floor. It's a silo. It's very singular, and folks don't seem to really care or manage about what things are going on outside the building. They're focused on their priorities, and that's that.
So let me ask you all before we take our quick break here, Mike, governor versus the legislature in this emergency special session authority, who wins?
Oh, the governor wins because a federal judge, any federal judge, will declare this unconstitutional in 5 minutes. It will take longer to walk up the stairs and file the papers than it will for the judge to make that decision. That's all there is to it. Now, to get to Lindsay Marie's point, if you want to reduce the powers of the governor, by the way, he's already the weakest governor in America by Constitution. But if you want to reduce his powers even more, you change the Constitution. You don't violate the Constitution, which I don't think anybody on this show believes in violating the Constitution by any means.
Lindsay Marie, governor versus legislature, who wins?
Like I said, I hope the legislative body wins, but we'll see what happens.
Lindsay Ships, governor, legislature.
Second floor, always. Governor will always win.
All right. Our guests today on the program are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Lindsay Ships, Libertarian Lindsey Marie. We're going to take ourselves a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about some redistricting and how did lawmakers overall this session deal with the pandemic. All that's still ahead on Indiana Issues. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Our guests on the program today are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Lindsay Ships, and Libertarian Lindsey Marie. We're talking about the 2021 legislative session. And so, my question for you folks now is that part of the reason why lawmakers did not sine die, that's Latin for go home for a while, they only recessed temporarily, was because of the fact they don't have the census data in, and so they can't do the redistricting. Mike, let me start with you, because I want to say you were in the legislature the last time Republicans drew the map. What do you expect this time?
Well, I expect a preservation of the Republican advantage. They will redistrict to preserve their supermajority if they can. By the way, I always thought that sine die was meant time to go get a beer, but I could be wrong. Maybe that was something I learned mistakenly. But October, the problem with October is it sets back all of the election planning decisions on whether to run for office. If you get lumped in with a member of your own party in a new district, do you run or do you retire? It just really screws with the timing.
Lindsay Ships, let me ask you, what do you see Republicans doing with redistricting?
They'll do their best to preserve what they've got, and they'll do their best to skewer the others on the other side of the aisle. That is no secret. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it would be if Democrats were in a supermajority. Let's be honest, it happens both ways, and it's the reason that the Independent Coalition for Redistricting has called for citizens to be in charge of redistricting instead of those who have vested interests in the decision making.
Abdul, let me add one thing here. Redistricting does not always work out as planned. Let me give you an example. In 2001, Ed Mahern was in charge of drawing the districts. 2 years later, or actually maybe a year later, he lost his district. even though he designed his own district. So it doesn't always work out the way people think it's going to work out.
Lindsay, let me get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Republicans are going to do their best to work their advantage in this case. And as Lindsay Ships admitted to, Democrats would do the exact same thing. I don't think it's really going to affect the Libertarians much. Normally what impacts Libertarians is ballot access laws and signature laws. So in this case, it's going to kind of be a toss-up.
Good thing that bill failed.
Yeah, exactly. Mike, let me ask you this, though, because one thing I've been looking at for the past few weeks now has been sort of demographic data here in the state of Indiana. And what I found for a column that I'm working on for one of my statewide publications is the fact that 50 to 70 rural counties have all either lost population or been stagnated over the past 10 years. Now, of course, we'll have the official data once the census information comes out almost to the precinct level. But just looking at that, the fact that rural counties are losing population, those folks are migrating either to the suburbs or urban centers, doesn't that mean that the Republican supermajority is in jeopardy?
Well, it could be. It could be reduced both in the House and Senate, in the State House, but it also could be reduced as a part of the congressional delegation redistricting as well. There's a good chance we're going to drop to 8 House seats. So then the Republicans have to decide, do we have an Andre Carson safe seat and somehow take out a Democrat in the Lake County area? I think it's Frank Mervan Jr. Or how do they handle that? There's a temptation, and so far I think Republicans have actually resisted that temptation. There's a temptation to be greedy when it comes to congressional district redistricting. So the Republicans generally have thought that, even though we could have made it an 8-1 state, we put other Republican members at risk when we do that. So 7-2 seems to be kind of the equilibrium that we're reached. I don't know what happens if we go to 8 this year. We used to have 13, and we have just steadily fallen. The other thing that's happening, Abdul, is not only the population decreasing in the rural areas, the jobs are like sucking toward central Indiana. The central Indianapolis and the donut counties are like a big black hole, and they're sucking all the jobs, the financial decision making, the economic development. That's all coming toward central Indiana, and it doesn't bode well for some of these great Hoosier towns that are trying to survive.
Lindsay Ships, let me ask you about that, because with the population shifting from rural areas to more suburban, more urban areas, does that put rural lawmakers, say, put folks on the other side of Crawfordsville, potentially in the same district?
It does. And man, you certainly saw those fights fought this legislative session with these type of town and gown issues. Local control issues were number one at the legislature this year of topic of discussion, and time spent on those topics were incredible. And some of these really large bills ended up dying at the very last moment. I mean, even Senator Mark Mesmer said dealing with the wind and solar siting bill was like dealing with hostage negotiators. So, this is a really, really dire issue that needs to be discussed. But you have a lot of opinions on this again. And as the rural communities continue to lose population, you will see that conversation still yet beginning to shift.
Lindsay, let me ask you before we change gears real quick here. Do you see Republicans possibly losing their supermajority because of these population shift and trends here in the state of Indiana?
Not in the immediate future, but I think long-term, yes. I think it's sliding that way. And I think you might even start to see Libertarians start to win more at the local level and start building that up too. I know the Libertarian Party in Indiana has a slate ready to go. They want to run a candidate in every single race possible. So I think just the dynamics changing, demographics changing, that slowly but surely, yes, the Republicans will eventually lose their majority.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org, coming to you live from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. My friends, I want to ask you to go circle back to how we kind of started this conversation with how session has gone. How do you think lawmakers have handled the pandemic, both from a procedural perspective, but also from a legislative perspective? Mike Murphy, we'll start with you.
I think the legislators have, until they got into the session, handled the pandemic very well, because they believed, Republicans and Democrats, I think, believed that the governor and Dr. Box should follow the science. And I think that's why Indiana came out as one of the leaders, not only in recovering economically, but also recovering the public health. And I think that was great. I do think, I think the legislators stepped in it in trying to take away power from the governor, violate the Constitution. I also think they stepped in it when they took away from county health officers, the professionals, and handed to politicians the decisions on local health policies.
Lindsay Ships, how do you think lawmakers handled themselves both procedurally and substantively this session?
I'll go to your first point immediately, and that's procedure. And I say this only because I work in other states as well, and other state legislatures are still working remotely. You still have opportunities to give testimony remotely in a safe manner, and that allows folks, especially in the human services communities, who really need to take part in these conversations, especially regarding budget conversations. It allows them to take part in the negotiation without putting their immunodeficiencies at risk. And that's something that's really important that was called on by human needs communities early on in the session and didn't happen. Folks simply could not take part unless they wanted to submit written testimony, which never was entered into any sort of public record unless they took to social and made it a public relations campaign themselves. So it really highlights the need for more effective and more robust procedures regarding transparency at the Indiana State Legislature.
Lindsay Marie, how do you think they handled things from a COVID-19 perspective, both from a substantive level with the laws they passed, and also just from procedural, how they handled themselves inside the Capitol building and the government center?
Well, I agree with Lindsay Ships that definitely there should be a way for citizens to voice their concerns or maybe their praise over a bill without having to risk their health, especially in this kind of situation. I know that there were libertarians who did want to voice their opinions about certain things, but because of health reasons, they just didn't go or they couldn't go. I think within the state, if we really want to make sure everyone's heard, we need to make ways available to do that. And with Zoom and everything else is on Zoom. Why couldn't we find a way? And then also, I think from the other side of it, I think a lot of libertarians tend to feel that the governor overstepped his bounds, and they would argue that he says, I have the power to do this because of this Indiana code. And then they would argue that the Indiana code is actually going to be below the Constitution, which says, the Constitution says that only the legislative body can write laws. So I think there's still a lot of anger there. And I think a lot of people are concerned about the long-term effects that we don't know in terms of mental health. What will the numbers look like, a year from now, 2 years from now? We look at businesses, we look at all kinds of things. What does this actually end up looking like in the long term? We only know short term right now.
My friends, we got just a couple minutes left here, so we're going to jump to our predictions and prognostications. We're going to do this a little differently and sort of ask you, out of 2021, what was the best bill you saw? What was the worst bill you saw? Mike Murphy, we'll start with you.
I think the best was, I don't know if it wasn't a bill, it was a line item, I guess, in the budget, was the $250 million investment in broadband. Absolutely.
And what was the worst bill you saw, my friend?
The worst bill was the attempt to violate the Constitution by the Republican legislative leadership. They're going to rue the day they did that.
All right. Lindsay Ships, best bill and worst bill that you saw this session.
I think the best bill ended up being the budget, and that will adequately fund Hoosiers for the next 2 years with priorities that we haven't seen for decades. So I'm pleased to see a bipartisan budget like that move forward. The worst bill, I think, was probably House Bill 1369. I'm so glad that bill died. That would have granted, we didn't get to talk about the red flag law today, but that bill would have granted blanket carry without permitting fees. So, and please correct me if I'm repeating the digest of that incorrectly, but I was not impressed to see that bill filed, and I'm so glad it died.
Lindsay Marie, your thoughts, best bill and worst bills?
Best bill that I was hopeful for was ending cash bail, and worst bill would be the budget and specifically the e-cigarette tax at this point.
All right.
The long-term effects.
All right, we got you. Well, our guests today, ladies and gentlemen, on the program have been Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Lindsay Ships, and Libertarian Lindsay Marie. Mike, Lindsay, and Lindsay, thank you all very, very much for being with us today. We do appreciate it. And that's going to wrap up the program for today. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Thank you all very, very much for being with us. We do appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.